couple of weeks ago, you might recall, we were talking about some of our favorite Christmas movies and TV shows. And if I had to come up with just one word that describes the theme, I think that ties them all together, it would be this one. Transformation, right? Transformation. Sometimes in these stories, the transformation is obvious. I mean, it's in your face obvious, right? For example, the story of Scrooge up there in A Christmas Carol. And I think we could probably add the Grinch to that list. Those characters go from villain to hero. There's this complete transformation within the course of the story. And then the other ones are maybe a little more subtle. George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, for example. George is a good guy. He's a hero from start to finish, but he thought that he had to take the weight of the world on his own shoulders, all by himself, and he was having what we could charitably call a serious case of burnout, until something I can only call Christmas consciousness helped him to see that he didn't have to go it alone anymore. He didn't have to bear these burdens alone. Charlie Brown, another example of a more subtle form of transformation. Charlie Brown's a really, really good kid, isn't he? He's a really good kid with a serious inferiority complex. He was perceptive and sensitive, and so he's becoming frustrated and cynical about Christmas until he finally stopped caring about what others were thinking about him. He decided to do Christmas his own way. And much to his great surprise and delight, all the other kids decided that he was right all along. And they turn out to embrace that less than perfect little tree that he picked up, remember that? And they joined him singing Christmas carols under the stars. That was his transformation experience, subtle but still profound. And then one final story, Miracle on 34th Street, which I mentioned again a couple weeks ago. It's the story of a single mother, Doris Walker, who didn't want her daughter to be exposed to fairy tales and superstition and supernatural explanations for perfectly natural phenomena. So she wanted to make sure that little Susan knew that Santa was just a story. Well, by the end of that movie, Doris, the mother, learns that a little imagination and fantasy makes for a much more interesting and enjoyable and satisfying life. Now, she doesn't turn into a true believer. That doesn't happen. Doris is not really convinced that Santa is real, but what she experiences and what she sees is the power of an idea. I love the last scene in the movie. Little Susan wanted to live in a house with a yard and a swing instead of that Manhattan apartment where they were living. Kris Kringle invites them to spend Christmas morning with him at the nursing home where he lived. They have a little morning Christmas party. And after the party, Kris gives them directions on how to get home from that part of town. He gives them very specific directions, a very specific route to follow. And along the way, Susan sees this house. She sees this house, which was the exact house that she had been dreaming of for years, complete with the yard and the swing in back. It was the only thing that she wanted for Christmas. And lo and behold, the house is empty. There's a for sale sign out front. And once they get inside, there was this scene. There, leaning against the wall inside the house, is the cane that old Kris Kringle had been using throughout the movie. Now, of course, if they wanted this house, they'd still have to pay for it. They'd still have to make an offer. They'd still have to pay for it. It isn't like the deed is sitting there on the table someplace, but it's still a gift. It's still a gift. Doris sees and experiences the power of an idea, how seemingly miraculous things can happen that aren't supernatural, and yet they're powered by a story that may or may not be true. Doesn't matter if Chris is really Santa Claus in this story. He still made Susan's dream home possible. And now, the rest was up to them. There comes a time when it's more important to embody the idea behind a story rather than believe in the literal truth of it. It's more important to embody the idea behind Santa Claus, generosity, kindness, things like that. Those things are real and valuable. Generosity and kindness are real. They're valuable, and the bonus is that the story that they come from lives on. We get to continue enjoying the story because we tap into the consciousness behind it. We can honor the symbol. We can still have fun with the Christmas stories, with the Santa Claus stories, even though we have long known that if Santa and his reindeer could move fast enough to visit the homes of every good boy and girl around the world in just 24 hours, that they would have to travel at about 6.5 million miles per hour. And you all know what would happen then, don't you? They would burn up in the atmosphere just like a meteorite, because we know meteorites go a lot slower than that. Drop the literal stuff, and it's still a great story. Transformational even. Nothing is lost. The end result is the same. Transformation. A new worldview. A new perspective that maybe brings some joy, some hope into our existence when we need it the most. And I think the same thing can be said for the Christmas stories in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. Would it bother you much to learn that there's no really good evidence that those events really happened? Would it bother you to learn that the stories in Luke and Matthew are so different as to be essentially contradictory? Here's some of the differences right up here. You can see them listed side by side. In the story of Luke, Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth. They travel to Bethlehem from Nazareth, where Jesus is born, in a place where animals are fed. It doesn't say a stable, it just says it's a place where there's a manger, which is some place where animals are fed. Now in Matthew, in contrast, in Matthew, Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem. Jesus is born in their house there where they live. They move from Bethlehem to Nazareth about 2 years later after Jesus is born. In Matthew, the infant Jesus is visited at the house by what are called wise men. Wise men who travel from the distant land to the east, bringing these lavish gifts that are fit for a king. And Luke, no wise men, no gifts, just humble shepherds. And I hate to break this one to you. No drummer boy either. Not in Luke or Matthew. The only way you get a nativity scene that looks like this next one here, the only way you get a nativity scene that looks like this, with baby Jesus in a manger, with shepherds and wise men and a drummer boy, is by conflating two contradictory Bible stories and a song written in 1941 by Catherine Davis. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to go home and dismantle your nativity scene. There's no need to evict the camels, the wise men, the drummer boy, if you happen to have one. And by the way, there's nothing in the story from Matthew that says there were 3 of them, or that they were riding camels. More of the product of human imagination, because we love our stories. We love a good story. We love a good story that carries a powerful message, and there's nothing like a good story to serve as the vehicle for carrying our important and valuable ideas. That's how it works. So this Christmas season, we're going to see and hear all sorts of references to the nativity story, and it's especially the one from Luke. That's the one that we hear the most. And when we look beyond the basic literal storyline, we can start to get a sense of some of the deep, deep symbolism that this story gives to us. Each one of the four gospel writers had a slightly different agenda. They had a slightly different message that they were trying to convey with their stories. Each author was writing from the perspective of a different community, and each of those communities had their own experience of the significance of the life and teachings of Jesus. I would say, though, that Luke is probably the most radical and subversive of the four, and I think the Nativity story can give us a really good example of how that works. The most interesting thing I find in the Gospel of Luke, especially in the Nativity story, is that Mary gets a starring role. She's the star of the story. She's a positive role model, heroic, insightful, important. So, what's wrong with that picture? Doesn't it kind of go against this idea that we hear in our postmodern culture about how the Bible hates women? Right? About how the Bible treats women as second-class citizens and things like that. And yes, the Bible does have some terribly dysfunctional and archaic stories and rules involving women. People once believed the earth was flat too. But we learned, we evolved, we grew, we started telling new stories based on what we learn about reality. That's what we're seeing in the stories about Mary, especially in the Gospel of Luke. We're witnessing a major shift in consciousness. Mary's the hero of the story. She's an unwed teenage mother in a patriarchal society where women are relegated to childbearing and housework. No education. In the temple, they're segregated away from the men, subject to all sorts of discriminatory ritual purity laws. Hey, we have a hard enough time with single moms in our culture today. Imagine what it must have been like in first century Palestine to be an unwed single mother in a patriarchal society. And then think about the first part of that story in Luke, where the angel Gabriel appears to Mary, and what does he call her? He calls her blessed among women. Blessed among women. Think about that. A teenage unwed mother being called blessed by a messenger from God. Maybe the author was trying to send us a message here. So far, and almost all the way through the story, it's all about Mary. Joseph plays a bit part. Doesn't even have any lines. He's just sort of there in the background in Luke. Mary gets all of the dialogue. Mary and her cousin Elizabeth. They're the stars. They're the ones who get to deliver the good news. They're the messengers in a patriarchal society. I think it's remarkable that this happened back in first century Palestine. Elizabeth, as you might recall, she's going to be the mother of John the Baptist. He's the guy who grows up to be the advance man for Jesus when he started his ministry. And the story of Elizabeth is another not so subtle shot at the patriarchal values of the day. When Elizabeth gives birth, as was the custom back then, they bring the child to the religious authorities to be circumcised. And the religious authorities automatically assumed that the boy would be given the same name as his father, or at least the name of someone who was honored and important in the family, because, by golly, that's the way they always did it, right? Tradition. Elizabeth has a different story. She was told that the child's name was to be John. She received that message from a divine messenger. So she speaks up and she says his name will be John. And the authorities argue with her. How dare she choose the child's name, silly woman? Doesn't she know her place? Doesn't she know that that's not the name of the boy's father and that there are no other family members with that name? So they ignore her. They completely ignore her. She says his name is John. They ignore her and they go to the father. They go over her head, as they probably thought back then. They go to the father who couldn't speak. His voice had been taken away from him because he dared to not believe the message that his wife was to be with child at an advanced age. His voice had been taken from him. There's some symbolism there as well. He can't talk, but he writes down the words, "His name shall be John." He backs his wife. Imagine what the religious muckety-mucks must have been thinking at that point. What is the world coming to? A woman gets to name her child, and not only does her husband not put her in her place, but he agrees with her. What an affront to our traditional values, an attack on our sacred institutions. Harumph, 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 as it goes. The same kind of stuff that we hear from the reactionaries today in the face of any kind of significant social change. It was happening all the way back then. So as we can see, this is a message for us today. I submit that the Christmas story in Luke is radical, subversive, and unorthodox, and you don't have to twist the words and meaning in order to be able to see it. You don't have to do anything other than take that story and put it back in the proper context of the patriarchy back in those days to see the stunning contrast. Mary's story in Luke is a message of liberation. It's a message of freedom. It's about liberation from patterns of thought and beliefs that perpetuate suffering in the world. Mary still lived in a male-dominated patriarchal culture. Just because the events in that story were told did not change things immediately. She probably lived out the rest of her life still subject to the rules that gave her less rights than men. But through her story, what we see is the possibility of the dawning of a liberation in consciousness, which is always the starting point. It has to start somewhere. So this story is showing us a starting point. It's telling us that we have to be free in consciousness before we can start dismantling the rules and the structures that keep us in bondage physically. Lots of people were expecting Jesus to be a military-style Messiah who was going to free Israel from Roman occupation. Well, Luke is telling us that there are worse forms of oppression than military occupation that we need to work on first. We can't ever be free if we hold ideas in consciousness that see others as not worthy or less worthy of the same kind of freedom that we want for ourselves and take for granted for ourselves. That kind of privileged place that we place ourselves in as we at the same time deny what we have to others. That's what has to change. So once we get beyond the literal meaning of a story, that's when the real meaning can start to open up and do its work. And the best part is that we get to keep the story as we go on to embody the consciousness. Sounds like a win-win situation to me. See you next week.